The human had just returned to his quarters after a grueling shift on the station. The lights flickered overhead as the hum of the station's machinery echoed through the silent corridors. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to sleep, to forget the stress of his duties and the endless quiet of space. But as he turned the corner to his room, something strange caught his eye. At the end of the hallway was a figure standing motionless, their silhouette barely visible in the low light. At first, the human thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. The stress had been building up lately. Maybe he was imagining things. But as he drew closer, he could see the figure more clearly. It was a woman, but not quite a human woman. Her skin shimmered with an iridescent glow, and her eyes were a piercing shade of blue that seemed to reflect the stars themselves. She stood perfectly still, as though she were waiting for something, waiting for him. He stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? How did she get here? The station was secure. There shouldn't have been anyone on board that he didn't know. But there she was, standing silently in the hallway, a mysterious stranger whose presence seemed to send a chill down his spine. The alien girl didn't move, she didn't speak, but her gaze never left him, and that's when the words came, soft, almost a whisper. "Can I sleep beside you tonight, human?" The human's breath caught in his throat. The request was so unexpected, so out of place, that he found himself frozen for a moment, unable to process what she had just said. It wasn't a demand or a plea. It was a simple question, one that didn't seem to belong in the sterile and lifeless halls of the station. His mind was racing now. What was going on? Was this some kind of trick? Or was he dreaming? But the girl's eyes remained steady, locked onto her expression unreadable. And the more he looked at her, the more he felt a strange pull, as though something inside him was drawn to her. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had suddenly settled in his thoughts. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse and uncertain. The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a small step forward, her feet barely making a sound on the metal floor. She looked down briefly before meeting his gaze again. "I am no one," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I need your help." The human took a cautious step back, unsure whether he should be terrified or curious. He had heard rumors about strange occurrences on the station, but he had never imagined something like this would happen to him. He had never encountered an alien before, and now here was one standing in front of him, asking to sleep beside him of all things. The girl seemed to sense his hesitation, and her expression softened just a little, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, fear maybe, or longing, as if she had nowhere else to go, no place to hide from the unknown dangers that haunted her. "Please," he whispered, "I'm not dangerous, I just need a place to rest." The words struck him deeper than he expected. The vulnerability in her voice made him question his instincts. Part of him still screamed to be cautious, to stay away from her. After all, he didn't know who she was or where she came from, but another part of him felt an undeniable pull and urge to help her. The human took a slow breath, his hand moving instinctively toward the door to his quarters, but he didn't open it right away. Instead, he studied the alien girl for a moment longer. Something about her seemed familiar in a way he couldn't explain. She wasn't like the others he had seen on the station. No alien like her had ever come through before, and yet there was a strange familiarity about her presence. "I don't know who you are or what you want," the human said finally, his voice more firm this time. "But if you're not a threat, then I'll let you stay for the night, just until we figure this out." The girl nodded once, her expression softening, as if she had been holding her breath, and when the human opened the door, she stepped inside without another word, her presence filling the room as though she belonged there, as if she had always been part of this place. The door closed behind them, and for a moment there was only silence between them. The human still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but as he looked at her once more, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, as though he had made the right choice despite the uncertainty. And then the girl spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. "Thank you, human." The words hung in the air like a promise, or perhaps a warning, one he couldn't quite decipher. But as the human watched her settle onto the bed, his mind wandered to a single question, one that echoed louder than the others. What was really going on? And who was this alien girl who had just entered his life without warning? The door clicked shut behind them, And for a moment, the human stood still, staring at the alien girl, who was now seated on his bed. The silence between them was thick, the hum of the station's engines in the background, the only sound breaking the stillness he couldn't help but watch her. Her eyes were no longer filled with fear, but instead a deep wariness that seemed to weigh her down. The human could tell there was something more to her than what she had revealed so far, something she was holding back. But before he could ask her anything more, the station's alarms blared loudly through the corridors, sending a jolt of panic through his body. The human's heart raced as he looked at the girl. Her face was a mask of calm, but there was an undeniable tension in her posture. She was no longer the vulnerable being he had thought her to be. She was alert, now her senses sharp, as though she had known this moment was coming long before he had even realized it. "What's happening?" the human asked, trying to mask the fear in his voice. But the girl didn't answer. Instead, she stood up swiftly, moving toward the door, her movements graceful and fluid, almost like she had been trained for situations like this. The human followed her without thinking, but he was unsure of what he could do to help. If there was danger outside, the girl reached the door and paused for just a moment, her hand hovering over the control panel, as if she were weighing the options before her. She glanced back at him for the briefest of moments, her expression unreadable. But her eyes said it all. She was preparing to fight. "Stay close," she said, her voice low and urgent. "This station is under attack. They found me." The human's stomach dropped. A cold sweat began to bead on his forehead as the reality of the situation settled in. The girl wasn't just some lost traveler. She was being hunted, and now he was caught up in it. He had no choice but to follow her. No time to argue, no time to process, just pure instinct telling him to stay by her side. The girl opened the door, slowly peering out into the hallway before stepping into the corridor. She moved with the speed of someone who had been trained in combat, her steps barely making a sound as she scanned the area ahead of her. The human followed hesitantly, unsure of what was waiting for them outside. But his training kicked in. He had been through enough emergencies on the station to know that staying calm was the key. They moved quickly through the darkened corridors, the lights flashing red with each new alert. The human's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had never heard an attack on the station before, let alone one involving mercenaries hunting an alien. But as they rounded a corner, he saw them. The intruders, a group of heavily armed mercenaries in dark armor, were patrolling the hallway ahead, their weapons raised and scanning every door as if they knew exactly where to find their target. The human's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anyone like them before. Their cold expressions and deadly demeanor made it clear that they would stop at nothing to find the girl. The alien girl's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and determination. She turned to the human, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to move now." Before the human could respond, she grabbed his arm, pulling him into a side room. Just as one of the mercenaries passed by the door, they froze for a moment, waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade into the distance before the girl let out a quiet sigh of relief, her grip on the human's arm loosening just slightly. "Who are they?" the human whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would draw attention. "They're mercenaries," the girl replied, her voice tense. "Hired by the ones who betrayed my people. They've come to take me back." She paused for a moment, as though weighing how much to tell him before continuing. "They're the ones who destroyed my homeworld, and now they want to finish the job. They're after something I know, something my people left behind." Before they fell, the human was stunned. He had no idea that he was helping an alien fugitive, let alone one who was so deeply entangled in a galactic conspiracy. He didn't know what to say or how to process the information, but there was no time to think about it now. The mercenaries were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. The girl looked at him, her expression softening just a little. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this, but I can't do this alone," she whispered. "I need your help." For the first time since meeting her, the human realized that he wasn't just a passive bystander in this. He was now part of something much larger, something dangerous, something that could change the course of his life forever. He looked at her and noted his voice steady. "I'm with you," he said. With that, they moved again, creeping through the station's darkened halls, the weight of their actions heavier than ever, as they knew that this was only the beginning. They moved swiftly through the darkened station, the human's senses heightened as he followed the girl down narrow hallways, and through maintenance ducts, his heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing as the enormity of the situation sank in. This was no longer just a strange encounter with an alien. This was life and death. The mercenaries were hunting her, and by extension, they were now hunting him too. But something about the girl's presence calmed him despite the chaos swirling around them. As they turned a corner, they paused for a moment. The alien girl crouched low, her ears perked up, listening to the sounds of the station echoing through the vents. The human stood just behind her, his body tense, every nerve on edge, ready for whatever came next. "We have to keep moving," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible, but sharp with urgency. "They'll be here soon." She moved quickly, leading the way with silent confidence. She had clearly done this before, but the human wasn't so sure about his own ability to stay alive in the chaos of this situation. But there was no choice now, he had to trust her. They continued through the maze of corridors, the girl seeming to know exactly where she was going. She stopped only occasionally to check their surroundings, to ensure they weren't being followed, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She was constantly on alert. And it didn't take long for the human to realize that she was much more than a fugitive. She was trained a soldier of some kind, perhaps even an elite warrior. And as they moved deeper into the station, he found himself wondering just how much he truly knew about the girl standing beside him. "Why are they after you?" the human asked, his voice low, as he caught up with her, their footsteps echoing faintly in the narrow hallway. "What do they want from you?" The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she led them into a small utility room and closed the door behind them. They crouched in the shadows as she peered through a small window in the door, her eyes narrowing as she spotted movement in the distance. "They want information," she replied, her voice strained with tension. "Something my people left behind before we were scattered. They believe I know where it is, and they will stop at nothing to get it." The human's mind raced as he tried to piece together the situation. What could be so valuable that it would make them go to such lengths to capture her? "I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "If your people are gone, why are they still hunting you?" The girl turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Because even though my people are scattered, we still hold the key to something that could change the galaxy forever." She paused, her gaze distant, as though she were lost in thought. "The technology we possessed before our fall was beyond anything anyone could imagine, but it's lost now, and the ones who destroyed us want it back." The human was stunned. He couldn't even begin to comprehend the scale of what she was saying. The technology her people possessed could change the balance of power in the galaxy, and now it was hidden somewhere, lost to time. But if the mercenaries were looking for it, they weren't going to stop until they found it. "How do you know where it is?" the human asked, his voice urgent. The girl's eyes flicked to the floor, and for a moment she seemed hesitant, but then she met his gaze with a new intensity. "I don't know exactly where it is, but I know it's on this station somewhere," she said quietly. "Before they attacked us, we hid pieces of it here, in a place no one would think to look." The human's mind was spinning. If the mercenaries found the technology, they would have the power to control everything. The galaxy would be at their mercy, and the girl's people would have died for nothing. He couldn't let that happen. "We need to get to it before they do," the human said, his voice firm, despite the fear that churned in his stomach. "But how do we find it?" The girl turned to face him, her expression hardening with resolve. "We'll have to move carefully, and we'll need to work together," she said. "I have a way of finding the hidden locations, but we'll need to bypass the security systems on this station, and that's no easy task." The human nodded, even though he didn't fully understand what was involved. He knew they didn't have much time. The mercenaries were closing in, and if they didn't act fast, the station would be swarming with hostile forces, hunting them down one by one. He glanced at the girl, his pulse quickening. "What do we do first?" The girl gave him a small nod. "Follow me, and stay quiet. We have to access the central security control room. If we can disable the station's defenses, we'll have a better chance of getting to the location before they do." With it, she led the way again, moving swiftly and silently through the station's darkened corridors. The human stayed close behind, his mind racing with the weight of what they were about to do, the danger they were facing, and the knowledge that their only chance of survival depended on them finding the technology before the mercenaries did. They moved through the station's corridors with a sense of urgency, their footsteps quiet, but deliberate the human stayed close behind the girl, his eyes constantly scanning for any signs of danger. But it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. The station felt like it was closing in on them, as if the walls themselves were alive with the threat of discovery. The girl was focused, her movements precise and calculated. Her every step seemed to carry purpose. As she navigated through the maze of hallways and service tunnels, the human could tell she was no stranger to danger. But even with her calm demeanor, he could sense the tension in her. The weight of what they were doing was pressing on her shoulders just as much as it was on his. They reached a narrow maintenance shaft, and the girl paused, glancing up at the small hatch above them. She motioned for the human to follow her, and without a word he obeyed. They crouched down, and the girl expertly accessed the hatch controls and opened it with ease. She gestured for him to climb up first, and he did so quickly, pulling himself through the narrow opening and into the darkened space above. The air inside was stale and thick, with the scent of old machinery. The human crouched down beside her as they moved through the ventilation system. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but the girl seemed completely at ease, moving with purpose and confidence in the tight quarters. The human had to struggle to keep up. They crawled through the ducts for what felt like hours. It was likely only minutes. The tension was unbearable, the fear of being caught hanging over them like a storm cloud. The girl had told him that they needed to reach the central security control room if they were going to disable the station's defenses, but getting there wasn't going to be easy. The mercenaries were closing in, and every second they spent in the ducts was a risk. Finally, they reached the end of the vent. The girl carefully opened a small hatch and peered out into the hallway. She signaled for the human to stay low, and he obeyed, keeping his body pressed flat against the floor as she slipped out into the corridor. They had arrived at a junction in the station's layout. The control room was just ahead, but the path was heavily guarded. The girl looked at the human, her eyes sharp with determination. "We'll have to move quickly once we pass this junction," she whispered. "There's a guard post just around the corner. They'll spot us if we're not careful." The human nodded, his heart racing as they crouched down and slowly made their way toward the corner. The girl led the way, her body moving fluidly like a shadow, barely making a sound. The human followed closely behind, his mind focused entirely on staying out of sight. They reached the corner, and the girl paused, her body tense as she listened for any signs of movement. The human held his breath as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, but then the girl motioned for him to follow, and they rounded the corner without making a sound. Ahead of them was the entrance to the security control room, and just outside it 2 mercenaries stood guard, their weapons raised. As they scanned the hallway, the human's heart skipped a beat. The mercenaries were dangerously close, and if they were spotted now, it would all be over. The girl motioned for the human to stay back, and without a word she darted forward, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost. The human waited, his pulse hammering in his chest. As the minutes seemed to drag by, he could hear the mercenaries talking, but their words were muffled as they moved away from the entrance. Then the girl emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly and silently. She reached the control room door, and in a flash she disabled the security lock. With a quick flick of her wrist, the door slid open without a sound. They were inside. The girl stepped in first, and the human followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the room. It was a large space, filled with rows of monitors and control panels. But the girl wasted no time. She went straight to the central terminal and began typing quickly, her fingers flying across the keys as she accessed the station's systems. The human stood guard near the door, his eyes constantly darting toward the hallway. Just outside the control room, his senses were on high alert. The tension was unbearable. He knew that at any moment, the mercenaries could find them, and everything would come crashing down. Finally, the girl looked up from the terminal, her face serious. "I've disabled the station's external defenses," she said. "We have a window of time, but it won't last long." The human nodded, his breath coming in short bursts. "What now?" The girl glanced at the terminal again, then back at him. "Now we go to the hidden location," she said. "It's time to find what they've been hunting." They turned and moved toward the door. The human felt the weight of what they were about to do pressing on him. They were about to face the unknown, a dangerous force that could change everything, but there was no turning back now. As they stepped out into the hallway, the girl's expression hardened once again, and the human could feel it. The storm was coming, and they were right in the middle of it. They moved swiftly through the station's halls. The air was thick with anticipation, and the sense that time was running out. The human could feel the weight of every step, his heart racing in his chest. As they navigated the darkened passageways, the girl moved ahead with purpose, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She was focused, as if she could sense the danger lurking just beyond their reach. The human kept close behind his mind, spinning with the new revelations about the alien technology hidden on the station. The girl's people had created something powerful and dangerous, something that could change the course of the galaxy. And now they were racing against time to find it before the mercenaries did. The pressure was mounting with each passing second, and the closer they got to the hidden location, the more intense the feeling of being hunted became. They reached a set of blast doors that led into a restricted section of the station. The girl hesitated for a moment. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the door's control panel. She reached for it with practiced hands, quickly overriding the security protocols and unlocking the door. The human stayed close, his senses alert for any sounds or signs of movement. The door slid open with a low hiss, and they stepped through into a dimly lit corridor that felt like it had been abandoned for years. The walls were covered in dust, and the air was stale with the scent of disuse. The human felt a chill run down his spine. This place felt wrong. It felt like they were walking through a forgotten part of the station, one that no one had dared to enter in a long time. The girl moved ahead with confidence, her steps steady. As she led the way down the long corridor, the human followed, unsure of what they would find, but knowing that they had no choice but to press on. As they walked, the girl's voice broke the silence. "This is where they hid it," she said, her tone flat, but filled with determination. "Before my people were scattered, they left everything here in case something went wrong." The human looked at her confused. "What do you mean scattered?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. The girl glanced back at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that took him by surprise. "My people were once a great and powerful civilization," she said, her voice distant. "But we were betrayed by those we trusted, and now we are scattered across the galaxy, each of us hiding from those who would destroy us to get what we left behind." The human swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. The girl's people had been betrayed and hunted, and now the mercenaries were after the last remnants of their power. The human couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt as he followed her deeper into the forgotten section of the station. He hadn't asked for any of this, yet here he was helping this alien escape a group of mercenaries and potentially saving the galaxy from a catastrophe. They reached another door at the end of the corridor, and the girl moved to the control panel once again, her hands working quickly to bypass the security lock. With a flick of her wrist, the door slid open, revealing a small chamber filled with advanced technology. The human stepped inside, his eyes widening at the sight of the equipment that filled the room. The room was unlike anything he had ever seen. The technology was far beyond anything the human race had developed. The walls were lined with strange devices and machines that pulsed with an eerie light. The air was charged with energy, as if the room itself was alive with the remnants of the girl's civilization. "This is it," the girl whispered, her voice almost reverent. "This is what they've been searching for." She moved toward a large pedestal in the center of the room, where a strange device sat encased in a transparent cube. The human stared at it. The shape of the object seemed familiar, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. The girl's eyes were fixed on the device, her expression a mixture of longing and fear. "This is the key to everything," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The technology we left behind has the power to change the galaxy, but if it falls into the wrong hands, it will destroy everything." The human took a step closer, his hand reaching out instinctively toward the device, but the girl stopped him, her hand on his wrist. "Don't," she said, her voice low. "It's too dangerous." The human pulled back his hand, feeling the weight of her warning, but his curiosity was still burning. "What is it?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The girl hesitated before answering, her eyes never leaving the device. "It's a weapon," she said, "a weapon of unimaginable power capable of wiping out entire fleets in an instant. The mercenaries know what it is, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." The human's stomach dropped at the realization the weapon they had been searching for was here, and it was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The consequences of its use were too terrifying to comprehend. "We need to destroy it," the human said, his voice firm as he looked at the girl. She shook her head slowly, her expression conflicted. "No," she said softly. "We can't destroy it, we have to keep it hidden. We can't let them find it." The human didn't know what to think anymore. The stakes had just escalated to a level he hadn't expected, and now they were faced with an impossible decision: keep the weapon hidden or destroy it, and risk the galaxy's future. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The girl met his gaze, her eyes filled with a determination he had never seen before. "We keep moving," she said. "We have to get out of here before they find us and take it." Without another word, she turned and led the way out of the room. The human followed, but his mind was still reeling with the implications of what they had just uncovered. The weapon was in their hands, but so were the mercenaries, and time was running out. The human followed the girl through the narrow halls. The air was thick with tension as they moved quickly. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow felt like a threat. They had uncovered something that could change everything, and now the mercenaries were closing in. They couldn't afford to waste time. The girl was leading them to an escape route, but the way out wasn't going to be easy. They turned a corner and the human caught sight of movement ahead. Figures in dark armor were advancing down the hallway. The girl stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. They couldn't go forward, and they couldn't retreat. There was only one option left. The girl grabbed the human's arm, pulling him toward a nearby maintenance closet. They squeezed inside. Just as the mercenaries turned the corner, their voices muffled, but growing louder. The human's breath was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. They couldn't be seen, they couldn't make a sound, but there was nowhere to hide. The only thing that kept him calm was the fact that the girl was standing beside him. Her presence was a steadying force, even in the face of danger. They waited in silence. As the mercenaries passed by, the human could hear their footsteps growing fainter and fainter until they were gone. The girl's grip on his arm loosened, and she gave a small nod, signaling it was time to move again. They slipped out of the closet and continued down the corridor. The girl moved with the same quiet precision as before, but now there was a sense of urgency to her steps. She was no longer the calm warrior he had come to know. She was focused on one thing, and one thing only: getting them out of there. They reached another junction, and the girl stopped once again, her eyes scanning the area ahead of them. The human stayed close. He could feel the sweat on the back of his neck as the silence stretched on. The waiting was unbearable, but the girl was patient. She knew when to move and when to stay still. Finally, she gestured for him to follow, and they darted across the open space toward a door on the far side of the corridor. The girl reached the door first and quickly accessed the control panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small room. Beyond it was a security room with a window that looked out over the station's exterior. The girl moved toward the terminal and began typing furiously, her fingers flying over the keys. As she accessed the station's communication systems, the human watched her in silence, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. They were moments away from reaching the escape route, but the stakes had never been higher. They couldn't afford any mistakes. "Just a few more seconds," the girl murmured under her breath, her eyes focused on the screen. She was accessing the station's emergency broadcast system and sending out a scrambled signal that would buy them a little more time. The human felt a sense of relief wash over him as the transmission went through, but it was short-lived. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hold. Mercenaries were closing in once again, and this time they were closer than ever. "We have to move now," the girl said, her voice low but urgent. Without waiting for a response, she moved toward the door, and the human followed her once again. They moved swiftly through the station, their steps light but quick as they navigated through the twisting passages of the station. The sense of being hunted was growing stronger with every turn. The girl led them toward an airlock at the far end of the station. They were almost there. They could taste the freedom that awaited them, but the airlock was guarded heavily, and the closer they got, the more they could feel the eyes of the mercenaries on their backs. The girl turned to the human, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "Stay close and do exactly as I say," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We can't afford to be spotted now." The human nodded, his mind was focused entirely on the task ahead. They were so close, But they were also running out of time. As they approached the airlock, the girl moved with a fluidity that took the human's breath away. She was a force to be reckoned with, every step precise and controlled. She reached the control panel for the airlock and began typing quickly, her hands moving faster than he could follow. But he could see the sweat on her brow. As the countdown began, "Come on," she muted under her breath. As the human looked nervously over his shoulder, he could hear the sound of boots clanging against the metal floor. The mercenaries were closing in on them. Finally, the airlock doors slid open with a soft hiss. The girl didn't hesitate. She grabbed the human's arm and pulled him through the doorway. They stepped into the outer docking bay, and the doors slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a small room with only the distant stars visible through the viewport. They were safe for now, but they both knew that the real battle was just beginning. The human stood in the small docking bay, staring out at the vastness of space. The stars glittered like a million scattered diamonds, but they didn't feel like a source of hope. Not now, not when they were still being hunted, and the danger was still closing in. The girl was at the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she worked to bring up the status of the docking bay. She had to make sure that the escape pod was still there. They didn't have much time. The mercenaries would know they were here any second, and once they did, they would come after them with everything they had. "Come on, come on," the girl muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the screen, her jaw set in determination. The human could see the sweat on her brow, the strain in her eyes. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a race against time, a desperate attempt to escape with something far more dangerous than either of them realized. The door to the docking bay suddenly slid open with a sharp hiss, and the human froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned toward the entrance, his breath held as he expected the mercenaries to come charging in, guns blazing. But instead, it was a single figure standing in the doorway. The human's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was it a trap? Were the mercenaries already here? But as the figure stepped into the bay, his heart sank. It was one of the mercenaries. The girl didn't react at first, her eyes still fixed on the control panel, but the human could see her body tense the way her hand hovered over a concealed weapon at her side. She was ready to fight, but the human could feel the weight of the situation settling over him. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The mercenary stepped forward slowly, his hand resting on the handle of his weapon, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, calculating look. He didn't speak at first, but the human could see the glint of recognition in his eyes. He had seen them before he knew who they were and what they had found. "Did you really think you could get away?" The mercenary said, his voice low and full of malice. "You're not getting out of here alive." The human's stomach dropped as the mercenary took another step forward. The tension in the room was thick as the girl stood still, her hand never leaving her weapon. She hadn't drawn it yet, but the human knew it was only a matter of time before they were forced into a fight. "Leave now," the girl said, her voice steady but cold. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." The mercenary sneered, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said, his voice growing louder. "I'm here to make sure you never leave this station." Before the human could react, the girl was moving faster than he could follow. She was on the mercenary in an instant, her hand a blur as she drew her weapon and fired a precise shot at the mercenary's chest. The sound of the blast echoed through the bay, and the mercenary crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless before it hit the floor. The human stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The girl hadn't hesitated. Not for a second. She had taken the shot without a moment's doubt. But the human wasn't sure if he was ready for this kind of violence. He hadn't signed up for any of this. He had just wanted to survive. But the girl was already moving. She was back at the control panel, her focus unshaken as she worked quickly to finish what she had started. "We don't have time to dwell on that," she said, her voice cold as she typed in the final commands. "The escape pod is prepped and ready. We're leaving now." The human nodded despite the shock still coursing through him. He knew she was right. They didn't have time to waste. They couldn't let the mercenaries regroup and track them down. The longer they stayed, the higher the chances that they would be caught. He moved toward the exit of the docking bay, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway beyond the airlock. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard now. They had already made too much noise, and they were running out of options. The girl followed closely behind him, her eyes sharp as she checked every corner, every shadow. She moved like a shadow herself, blending into the darkness with ease. But the human could feel the weight of their situation. The escape pod was their only chance of getting out alive, and it wasn't going to be easy getting there. They moved through the corridors quickly, the human's mind racing with the realization that they were running out of time. The mercenaries were going to catch up with them soon. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. Ahead of them, the girl signaled for him to stop. She crouched low, her eyes scanning the hallway. As she listened for any signs of movement, the human held his breath, his senses on high alert. The silence was unbearable, but the girl didn't move. She was waiting for something, and the human had to trust her instincts. "Get ready," the girl whispered. "We're almost there." With it, she led the way again, moving swiftly and silently through the hallways of the station. The human close behind, his thoughts focused entirely on the mission ahead. The escape pod was their last hope, and they couldn't afford to let it slip away. They moved through the darkened halls, the tension rising with each step. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls. But there was no time to slow down, no time to rest. The human could feel the girl's presence ahead of him, like a shadow guiding him through the darkness. She was determined and focused, but the weight of the situation was beginning to wear on him. The closer they got to the escape pod, the more danger they were in. They rounded another corner, and the human caught sight of more movement ahead this time. It wasn't just one mercenary. There were at least 5 of them clustered together, moving down the hallway, blocking their path. The human's heart skipped a beat. They had no choice now but to fight their way through. The girl stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she took in the situation. She didn't hesitate for a second. Her movements were precise as she dropped to a crouch, her weapon in hand. She was ready, but the human wasn't sure. He had never been in a situation like this before, never had to fight for his life. But there was no time to think about it now. The mercenaries were getting closer. They were only a few feet away, and they hadn't noticed the girl yet. They were too focused on their own movements, too caught up in their patrol. But that wouldn't last much longer. The girl knew it. She had to act fast. Without warning, she sprang into action, her body a blur of movement. As she launched herself toward the first mercenary, she moved with such speed that the human could barely keep up. He watched in awe as she took down the first one with a swift strike to the chest before spinning around and firing a shot at another. The sound of the blast reverberated through the hallway, and the remaining mercenaries turned toward them. "Run," the girl shouted as she fired another shot, taking out another mercenary in the process. But there were still too many of them, and they were closing in fast. The human hesitated for a moment, his feet frozen in place, but the girl grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. "Keep moving," she ordered as they sprinted down the hallway, the human's breath coming in short gasps. He could hear the mercenaries shouting behind them. But they didn't dare slow down, not even for a second. They had to keep moving. They had to make it to the escape pod. Ahead, the door to the docking bay loomed closer, but so did the mercenaries. They were gaining on them. The human's pulse raced as they neared the entrance to the docking bay. He could see the escape pod in the distance, but it still felt so far away. "Get to the pod now," the girl shouted, her voice full of urgency, her weapon still in hand. As she fired another round at the advancing mercenaries, the blast sent one of them stumbling backward, but there were too many to stop all at once. The human didn't hesitate this time. He broke into a full sprint, his legs pushing him forward with everything he had. The escape pod was within reach, just a few more steps, and they would be free. But the mercenaries were closing in fast. He could hear their footsteps pounding behind them. The air was thick with the sounds of the chase. They reached the airlock of the escape pod. Just as the mercenaries were rounding the corner, the girl hit the emergency override on the control panel, and the door to the pod slid open with a loud hiss. They both rushed inside. Without looking back, the girl slammed her hand against the control panel, and the door sealed shut. The human collapsed into the nearest seat, his chest heaving. As he tried to catch his breath, the girl was already at the controls, her hands moving with practiced ease. As she initiated the launch sequence, they had made it. They were safe for now, but the human knew it wasn't over, not yet. "Hold on," the girl said, her voice steady, but the human could hear the tension in her words. The pod was already shaking as the thrusters powered up, and the human gripped the seat tightly as the escape pod shot away from the station. They were free, but the battle was far from over. The girl's people was still out there, and the mercenaries wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The human didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: they were only just beginning to fight for their survival. The escape pod jolted as it broke free from the station. The human could feel the sudden weightlessness as the pod sped away into the vast emptiness of space. But even as they left the station behind, there was no relief. The hum of the engines filled the small cabin, but it was almost drowned out by the pounding of his heart. The girl was still at the controls, her eyes locked on the navigation screen, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her posture. They were free for now, but the danger wasn't over. The mercenaries would be coming for them. No matter how far they ran, the human couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe. Yet he leaned back in his seat, his mind racing, trying to process everything that had happened. The girl had saved his life more times than he could count, and now they were on the run from forces they barely understood. He turned his gaze toward her. She was focused, her fingers moving with quick precision across the controls, but her eyes were narrowed in concentration. There was something about her that intrigued him, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that he couldn't quite explain. He had never met anyone like her before. "Are we safe now?" he asked, his voice low. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer, but he needed to know. The girl glanced over at him, her face unreadable for a moment before she spoke, her voice steady. But there was a trace of something deeper, there a sense of uncertainty. "For now," she said, "but we're not out of danger yet." The human's stomach churned at the response. He had known it wasn't over, but hearing it confirmed was a different matter. "How long do we have?" The girl's fingers hesitated on the controls for just a split second. "Not long," she said. "The mercenaries will be tracking us. They won't stop until they get what they want." The human clenched his fists. He didn't know what they wanted, what they were after. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. He had to keep them both alive. He couldn't let anything happen to her, even if he didn't fully understand why. "How do we get away from them?" he asked, his voice filled with determination. The girl turned her gaze back to the screen, her eyes flicking over the various readouts. She didn't answer immediately, and for a moment, the human thought she might not respond at all, but then she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "We need to go deeper into uncharted space. We have to lose them in the outer systems." The human nodded, even though he didn't fully understand what she meant. He knew they had no choice. "How do we do that?" She looked over at him, her eyes sharp. "I have a route in mind, but it's risky," she said. "We'll have to navigate through some dangerous sectors, but it's the only chance we have." The human didn't hesitate. "Then we do it." The girl studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words, and then gave a small nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Hold on tight," she said as she adjusted the course, and the pod began to veer toward the outer edges of known space. The human leaned back in his seat as the pod accelerated faster and faster, the stars outside the viewport blurring into streaks of light. He had no idea where they were going or what would happen when they got there, but he knew one thing for sure: they couldn't stay in the known systems. Not with the mercenaries hunting them. They had to find a way to disappear. As the pod moved deeper into the unknown, the human tried to push aside the gnawing sense of dread that still lingered at the edges of his mind. He had never been a fighter, never been someone to take risks, but in this moment, he knew there was no choice. He had to keep going, even if it meant venturing into the darkest parts of space. The girl seemed to sense his thoughts, her voice breaking through the silence. "We'll make it," she said, her tone firm but reassuring. "We have to." He didn't say anything in response. Instead, he just stared out at the endless expanse of stars ahead of them. There was no telling what lay beyond the edge of known space. But there was one thing he was sure of. As they sailed into the dark, he wasn't alone anymore. They were in this together, no matter what came next. The escape pod rumbled as it sped through the void, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of their fragile existence in the vastness of space. And as they disappeared further into the unknown, the human couldn't help but feel a sense of both fear and excitement. They were running from something dangerous, but they were also running towards something new, and maybe, just maybe, they would find the freedom they were looking for. For now, that was enough.